My son was homeless with 3 kids, and he had no idea his mother was worth $85 million. My name is Helen Roberts, and I'm 72 years old. I'm sitting here in my Scottsdale home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of forgiveness, and I need to tell you something that's been weighing on my heart for years. This is the story of how my stubborn pride almost destroyed the most precious thing in my life, my family, and how sometimes the greatest gift we can give isn't money, but the courage to swallow our pride and say, "We're sorry." You see, I built an empire worth $85 million, but I was living like a pauper of the heart. My son David was out there, struggling, homeless with 3 beautiful grandchildren I barely knew, while I sat in my comfortable chair, nursing old wounds and foolish grudges. I thought I was protecting my dignity, but I was actually burying my soul alive. Some of you watching might think you know how this story ends, but I promise you, what happened next will change how you see family, forgiveness, and the true meaning of wealth forever. If you're here for the first time, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I share these stories because I believe in the power of second chances, and I don't want you to miss any of them. Now, let me take you back to where it all began to fall apart. The day I decided my son's wife wasn't good enough for our family was the day I started building a wall, brick by stubborn brick. Emma Martinez was a sweet girl from a working-class family, but I couldn't see past my own expectations. I wanted David to marry someone from our social circle, someone who understood business dinners and charity galas. I remember the exact moment I became the villain in my own son's story. It was at their engagement party, and Emma was nervously trying to make conversation with my friends from the country club. She mispronounced hors d'oeuvres and stumbled over the name of a wine vintage, and instead of helping her, I felt embarrassed. The tea service sat between us like a minefield, delicate china that Emma approached with the careful reverence of someone who knew its value exceeded her monthly grocery budget. When she reached for the sugar bowl and accidentally knocked over the small silver spoon, the tiny clatter seemed to echo through my judgment like a gavel. That should have been my moment to offer grace, to remember my own mother teaching me these same social dances decades earlier. Instead, I watched her fumble and felt my chest tighten with what I told myself was disappointment, but was really shame. Shame that my son had fallen in love with someone who reminded me too much of who I'd been before I learned to armor myself in Polish and protocol. That night, I pulled David aside and said words that would haunt me for years. "Son, are you sure she's the right fit for our family? Marriage is about more than love. It's about compatibility, background, shared values." His face changed in that moment like I'd slapped him across the cheek. But what I discovered next broke me. "Mom," he said quietly, "Emma is the kindest person I've ever met. If you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't fit." Those words should have been my wake-up call, but instead I doubled down on my position. The wedding happened without me. I sent a gift, an expensive crystal vase with no note, and told myself I was taking a principled stand. I convinced myself that David would come crawling back when reality hit, when he realized that love alone couldn't pay bills or build a future. But the call never came. Years passed, and my pride became a prison I'd locked myself into, throwing away the key with my own stubborn hands. What I didn't understand then was that Emma would prove me wrong in every way that mattered, not by learning to navigate my world, but by creating a better one, where love was the only currency that counted. While I was busy being right about everything, life was moving forward without me. My pharmaceutical consulting business, Roberts and Associates, exploded beyond my wildest dreams. We specialized in helping small medical practices streamline their operations, and within 5 years we had contracts with hospitals across 3 states. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was helping other people's families stay healthy, while poisoning my own relationships with toxic pride. Every business award I received, every article written about my success, felt hollow because I had nobody who truly mattered to share it with. I threw myself into work with the intensity of someone running from ghosts. 18-hour days became my normal. I convinced myself that building wealth was the same as building a meaningful life, that David would eventually understand and respect what I'd accomplished. When the offer came to sell Roberts and Associates for $85 million, I sat in that lawyer's office feeling completely alone. The buyers were a national healthcare corporation, and they wanted to acquire not just my business model, but my entire client network and operational systems. But what happened next changed everything. I signed those papers with hands that shook not from excitement, but from the devastating realization that I'd become rich in every way, except the ones that mattered. I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, but no family to build memories with. That night, I tried calling David's old number, but it had been disconnected. The silence on the other end of that dead line was the sound of consequences finally catching up with me. 2 years after selling my company, I hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen. I told him I needed to find my son for estate planning purposes, but the truth was simpler and more desperate. I was drowning in regret and needed to know if David was okay. Marcus returned with a folder that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Inside were photographs and reports that shattered what remained of my carefully constructed world. David had served 2 tours in Iraq as an army sergeant and had been injured in an IED explosion that damaged his lower spine. The pictures showed a man I barely recognized, thinner, older, with lines around his eyes that spoke of pain both physical and emotional. But it was the next page that brought me to my knees. Emma had died of ovarian cancer 8 months earlier, leaving David alone with 3 children. Tyler, 12, Sophie, 8, and Jake, 5. The manila envelope trembled in my hands as I spread those photographs across my mahogany desk, like tarot cards predicting a future I'd already lost. Each image was a testimony to my absence. School photos I'd never seen, birthday parties I'd never attended, graduations I'd chosen to miss. The investigator's clinical notes read like an autopsy of my own motherhood. My hands trembled as I studied photographs of my grandchildren, children I'd never met because of my own selfish pride. Tyler had David's stubborn chin and serious eyes that held wisdom no 12-year-old should carry. Sophie clutched a worn doll that looked like it had been loved nearly to death, her smile uncertain but still hopeful. Jake, barely 5, stood holding his father's hand with the kind of fierce loyalty that broke my heart into pieces. Marcus's report was clinical but devastating. David's disability benefits barely covered rent and food. Emma's medical bills had drained their savings. The family was living with Emma's parents, Frank and Carol Martinez, in a cramped house in Riverside, California. But what Marcus told me next made my blood run cold. He'd observed the family dynamics for weeks, and Frank and Carol were treating David and the children like unwelcome burdens, making cutting remarks about David's inability to get his act together and be the man Emma deserved. That night, I paced my empty mansion until dawn, my footsteps echoing through rooms that had been decorated for a life I'd never lived. While I'd been nursing wounded pride in my palace of isolation, my son had been fighting wars, both foreign and domestic, and I hadn't been there for any of it. Marcus called me on a Tuesday morning with urgency in his voice that made my coffee cup slip from my hands. "Mrs. Roberts, you need to know what happened yesterday. Frank and Carol kicked David and the children out. They're homeless." The words hit me like a physical blow. My son, my decorated veteran son, was on the streets with 3 grieving children because his in-laws had decided they were too much trouble. Marcus described the scene. David loading everything they owned into garbage bags. Sophie crying quietly while holding Jake's hand. Tyler trying to be brave while his world crumbled around him. Frank's parting words, according to Marcus, were burned into my memory. "David, we're done enabling this situation. You need to figure out how to be a real provider, not just another mouth we have to feed. Emma's gone, and frankly, we never signed up to raise her kids along with a grown man who can't even hold down a job. I hung up the phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I cried until my chest ached. Not the polite tears of a dignified woman, but the ugly, desperate sobs of a mother who suddenly understood she'd been living in a prison of her own making while her child suffered. That afternoon, I drove to Riverside and parked across the street from the Martinez house, watching Frank wash his car in the driveway. Like he hadn't just thrown 3 innocent children out of the only stability they had left. The callousness of it made me physically sick, but it was seeing David's truck parked outside Mrs. Rosa Garcia's small house 3 blocks away that finally shattered the last of my resistance. My son was depending on the kindness of strangers because his own mother had been too proud to swallow her mistakes and too stubborn to offer the help she was more than capable of giving. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being a bystander in my own son's story. I spent 3 sleepless nights crafting a plan that would allow me to help David without crushing his pride, because I'd finally learned that dignity mattered more than control. I couldn't just show up with a check. That would feel like charity to a man who'd served his country and lost his wife while maintaining his integrity through unimaginable circumstances. My lawyer, Robert Williams, thought I'd lost my mind when I outlined what I wanted to do. "Helen," he said, adjusting his glasses with the patience of someone who'd known me for 15 years. "You want to create an entire foundation, hire staff, establish offices, and fund veteran housing projects just to offer your son a job. Why not simply call him?" "Because," I explained, "David needs to feel like he's earning his way back, not being rescued by the mother who abandoned him. He needs purpose, not pity. And frankly, Robert, this country has failed our veterans. If I can use my resources to fix that problem while rebuilding my relationship with my son, then it's not just charity, it's justice." The Hope Foundation for Veterans became real within 6 weeks. I rented office space in Phoenix, hired a small staff of social workers and case managers, and began reaching out to veteran organizations across Arizona. Our mission was simple: provide housing, job training, and mental health support for veterans struggling with the transition to civilian life. David's qualifications were perfect, not because he was my son, but because he'd lived the struggle we were trying to address. His military experience, combined with his recent challenges, made him uniquely qualified to understand what our clients needed. The position of program coordinator came with a salary of $75,000 and full health benefits. Robert made the call on a Friday morning, introducing himself as the Foundation's attorney and explaining that David's name had come up during their research into local veterans who might be interested in helping establish their new program. When David agreed to an interview, I felt hope bloom in my chest, like a desert flower after rain, unexpected, fragile, and heartbreakingly beautiful. But I also felt terrified, because after all this time, I still didn't know if my son would be able to forgive the mother who'd failed him when he needed her most. I watched from my car as David walked into the Hope Foundation offices for his interview, wearing his only good shirt and carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had always made me proud. He looked thin and tired, but there was something unbroken in his posture that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with being his mother in the first place. Robert conducted the interview while I waited in the adjoining conference room, listening through the slightly open door. David's voice was deeper than I remembered, roughened by years of struggle and loss. But when he talked about his fellow veterans, it carried a passion that brought tears to my eyes. "The hardest part," David said, "isn't the physical injuries or even the nightmares. It's feeling like the country you served doesn't understand what you sacrificed or how to help you find your place again. We don't need pity. We need purpose. We need to feel like our skills and experiences matter in civilian life." I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart crack open at the raw honesty in his voice. This was the son I'd raised, the boy who'd brought home injured birds and insisted we nurse them back to health, who'd stood up to bullies twice his size to protect smaller kids. The compassion had always been there. Life had just deepened it, until it became a calling. Robert asked about his current situation, and David's honesty was heartbreaking. I'm staying with a neighbor who's shown me more kindness than I probably deserve. My children have been through hell, losing their mother, then being uprooted from the only other home they knew. I need stability for them. But more than that, I need to feel like I'm contributing something meaningful to the world again. When Robert offered him the position, David was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. This seems too good to be true. Why would you choose someone with my track record of recent failures? I haven't exactly been a success story lately. Because, Robert said, glancing toward the door where he knew I was listening, sometimes the people who've been broken are the ones best equipped to help others heal. And because the founder of this organization believes that every veteran deserves a second chance to build something meaningful. David accepted the position, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He was scared to hope, scared to believe that his luck might finally be changing. That caution in his tone told me everything I needed to know about how much my absence had cost him. But it also told me something else. Despite everything he'd endured, my son was still the good man I'd raised him to be, just deeper and wiser and infinitely more compassionate than the young man I'd pushed away all those years ago. The weight of that realization settled in my chest, like both a blessing and a burden I'd carry forever. David worked for the Hope Foundation for 3 weeks before I finally gathered the courage to reveal myself. Those were the longest and most anxious weeks of my life, filled with second-hand reports from Robert about David's incredible work ethic and natural leadership abilities. He was already transforming our fledgling organization with his insights and genuine care for the veterans we served. But I could also see the questions building in David's mind. He'd started asking Robert about the foundation's founder, wondering why someone would invest so heavily in veteran services but remain completely anonymous. It's unusual, he told Robert, for someone to fund this level of operation without wanting any public recognition. Most philanthropists like to put their names on buildings. I knew I was running out of time before David's natural suspicion would turn to investigation. So I asked Robert to arrange a meeting between David and the Foundation's primary benefactor on a Friday evening at the Phoenix office. I spent that entire day alternating between rehearsing what I'd say and fighting the urge to flee back to Scottsdale. When David walked into that conference room and saw me sitting at the table, the look on his face was something I'll carry to my grave. Shock, confusion, anger, and underneath it all, a flicker of the little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and bad dreams. "Hello, David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I know this is unexpected, the understatement of the century, but it was all I could manage without completely breaking down. David stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like forever. Then he sat down across from me, his hands folded on the table, and asked the question that cut straight to my heart. "How long have you known? About Emma, about the kids, about everything." "Too long," I admitted, "and not long enough. I hired someone to find you 2 years ago, David. I've known about your service, about Emma's illness, about your struggles. I've known, and I've been too much of a coward to reach out until I couldn't live with myself anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at his hands, processing the revelation that his mother had been watching his life fall apart from a distance while sitting on a fortune that could have changed everything. "Why now?" David asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Why, after all these years of silence, did you decide to create this elaborate charade instead of just picking up the phone?" I took a shaky breath, knowing that my next words would either begin to heal the chasm between us or make it permanently unbridgeable. "Because I was ashamed, David. Ashamed of how I treated Emma. Ashamed of missing your wedding. Ashamed of not being there when she was sick and you were scared and overwhelmed. I was ashamed of being the kind of mother who let pride matter more than love." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. So I continued. "But mostly, I was ashamed because I knew that if I'd just swallowed my foolish prejudices and welcomed Emma into our family, You would never have had to face any of this alone. I robbed all of us of years we can never get back. And I robbed Tyler, Sophie, and Jake of knowing their grandmother when they needed family most. So you thought creating a fake foundation was better than just saying you were sorry. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate. Do you have any idea what it's been like, Mom? Watching Emma fade away? Knowing I couldn't afford better treatment? Staying awake at night wondering how I was going to feed my kids? Being treated like a failure by people who should have supported us? No, I said honestly. I don't know what that's like, but I know what it's like to lie awake at night knowing your child is suffering and you're too stubborn to help. I know what it's like to have more money than you can ever spend and feel spiritually bankrupt because you chose being right over being loving. David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Phoenix skyline. When he finally looked back at me, his eyes were wet, but not accusatory. The foundation is real, though. This isn't just some elaborate way to give me charity. It's completely real, I assured him. We've already helped 12 veteran families find stable housing, and we're breaking ground on our first transitional housing complex next month. Your work these past 3 weeks has been extraordinary. David, you've taken my money and my good intentions and turned them into something that actually changes lives. This foundation needs you, not because you're my son, but because you're exactly the right person for this job. David nodded slowly, and I saw something shift in his expression. I need you to meet them, he said quietly. Tyler, Sophie, and Jake. They've asked about you, about whether they have any family besides the Martinezes. I've never known what to tell them. My heart clenched with a mixture of hope and terror. Are you sure? I understand if you need more time, or if you think— Mom, David interrupted, and it was the first time he'd called me that since walking into the room. They're good kids who've been through hell. They deserve to know their grandmother, even if she's been an absent fool for most of their lives. David brought Tyler, Sophie, and Jake to the foundation offices the following Saturday, and I swear I forgot how to breathe when I first saw them walk through those doors. They were beautiful, cautious, and heartbreakingly polite, the kind of children who'd learned too young that adults could disappoint you and leave. Tyler, at 12, was clearly the family protector. He positioned himself slightly in front of his younger siblings and watched me with intelligent, assessing eyes that reminded me so much of David at that age. Sophie, 8 years old with Emma's dark curls and gentle smile, clutched a small stuffed elephant that looked like it had been loved nearly to death. And Jake, sweet 5-year-old Jake, hid behind his brother's shoulder but kept peeking at me with curious brown eyes. Kids, David said gently. This is your grandmother, my mom. Her name is Helen. The introduction was simple, but I could hear years of complicated emotions underneath those words. Hello, Tyler said formally, extending his hand for a handshake. Dad says you're the one who gave him this job. Even at 12, he was already thinking about family finances and stability. It broke my heart that he'd had to grow up so fast. Sophie stepped forward and surprised me by asking, "Do you have any pictures of our mom?" Dad doesn't have very many, and we lost some when we had to move. The innocent question hit me like a freight train, because of course I didn't have pictures of Emma. I'd been too proud to be part of their life when she was alive. I don't, sweetheart, I admitted, kneeling down to Sophie's level. But I would love to see some of yours, if you'd like to share them with me. And maybe you could tell me about her. I'd like to know about your mom. Jake finally emerged from behind Tyler and shocked everyone by walking straight up to me and asking, "Are you rich?" Mrs. Martinez said Dad's mom was probably rich, and that's why she never visited us. The brutal honesty of children cut straight through any pretense. Then he whispered conspiratorially, "Can you buy us ice cream? Tyler says we can't ask for things, but I really like strawberry." David started to correct him, but I held up a hand. "Yes, Jake, I am rich. I have a lot of money. But do you know what I don't have?" Jake shook his head solemnly. "I don't have any pictures of you three on my refrigerator. I don't know what your favorite foods are, or what books you like, or whether you're afraid of thunderstorms. I have money, but I've been very poor in all the ways that really matter." Sophie looked thoughtful for a moment, then said quietly, Mama used to say that being poor in love is the worst kind of poor. Is that what you mean? The wisdom in her 8-year-old voice undid me completely. Tyler, Sophie, and Jake exchanged glances with the wordless communication that siblings develop. And then Tyler asked the question that would determine our future. Would you like to learn? About us, I mean. Dad says learning about people is more important than just knowing about them. That afternoon with my grandchildren opened floodgates I didn't even know existed. Tyler showed me his collection of military history books and told me about his dream of becoming an engineer. Sophie shared her drawings, dozens of pictures of families with missing pieces, houses with extra rooms for people who might come back, trees with deep roots and spreading branches, and Jake, sweet Jake, fell asleep in my lap while I read him a story about a grandmother who lived too far away but loved her grandchildren too much. Over the following weeks, David and I established a careful routine. The children would come to my house in Scottsdale on weekends, and slowly, so slowly, we began building the relationships I'd thrown away through stubborn pride. I learned that Tyler worried constantly about money and had been secretly tutoring younger kids for pocket change. Sophie had nightmares about losing more people she loved. Jake just wanted someone to push him on swings and read him bedtime stories without looking sad while they did it. Have you ever let pride get in the way of family? As women who've lived through decades of challenges, we know how easily stubborn moments can turn into years of silence. If you had a second chance to choose differently, what would you do? Share your wisdom in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today. I discovered that Tyler collected bottle caps, believing each one held a small story. Sophie had memorized every constellation her mother had taught her, whispering their names like prayers when she couldn't sleep. Jake insisted on setting the table for one extra person at every meal, just in case someone lonely needs dinner. These children, despite losing so much, still opened their hearts with the fearless generosity that only comes from being deeply loved. Time, I was learning, doesn't simply pass. It accumulates. Each weekend with my grandchildren added layers to my understanding of what I'd lost and what I might still rebuild. The silence that had once been my prison was becoming my strength, a space where healing could take root without fanfare or declaration. But the universe, it seems, has its own sense of timing. Just as I was beginning to believe in the possibility of peaceful redemption, the past came knocking, literally and figuratively, demanding its own form of reckoning. 3 weeks into David's work at the foundation, I witnessed something that transformed my understanding of redemption. David came to me with a case that had kept him awake for 2 nights straight. A young veteran named Marcus Thompson, 26 years old, living in his car with his 4-year-old daughter after his wife left during his struggle with PTSD. "Mom," David said, and hearing him call me that still made my chest tighten with gratitude. This man reminds me of myself 6 months ago. He's too proud to ask for help, too broken to trust that help might actually come. I think you need to meet him. We drove to the McDonald's parking lot where Marcus had been living in his battered Honda Civic, and I watched my son approach this stranger with the kind of gentle authority that comes only from walking through hell and choosing to come back for others. The conversation was soft, careful, 2 soldiers recognizing each other across the wasteland of bureaucratic failures and civilian misunderstanding. The August heat radiating from that asphalt parking lot felt like a cruel punishment for America's forgotten warriors. Marcus was wary, suspicious of what he called charity with strings attached. His daughter, Lily, clutched a ratty stuffed rabbit and watched us with the premature wisdom of children who've learned that adults don't always keep their promises. When David knelt down to her level and showed her pictures of Tyler, Sophie, and Jake on his phone, something shifted in the atmosphere of that parking lot. "The foundation isn't a handout," David explained to Marcus, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "It's a bridge. We help you get stable. Housing, job training, childcare. And then you help us build more bridges for the next guy." Every veteran we help becomes part of the solution for other veterans. Your daughter doesn't just get a home. She gets to see her father become the man he was meant to be. I stood back, watching my son offer this young father exactly what I'd offered David. Dignity wrapped in assistance, purpose paired with support. But what broke my heart open was seeing how David had taken my imperfect offering and made it perfect through his own understanding of what it meant to fall and rise again. That afternoon, we moved Marcus and Lily into one of our transitional apartments. As I watched him carry his daughter across the threshold of their new home, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck and her face buried in his shoulder, I finally understood what wealth actually looked like. It wasn't the number in my bank account. It was the multiplication of hope from one generation to the next, one family to another, one healed heart reaching back to heal the next broken one. And standing there in that small living room, watching David help Marcus figure out the apartment's quirky air conditioning, while Lily explored her new bedroom with wonder-filled squeals, I realized something profound. My son hadn't just forgiven me. He'd transformed my guilt into his calling, my regret into his purpose. He'd taken the worst thing I'd ever done and turned it into the best thing he would ever become. 3 weeks after witnessing David's transformation with Marcus, Frank and Carol showed up at David's front door on a rainy Thursday evening, their faces weathered by consequences, and their pride finally broken enough to bend. I happened to be there, helping Sophie with her science project about resilient plants, flowers that thrive in difficult conditions. She'd chosen with the unconscious wisdom of a child who understood survival. Carol looked older, smaller somehow, her carefully maintained appearance replaced by the humility that comes from losing everything you thought defined you. Frank stood behind her, hands shoved deep in his pockets, the confident hardware store owner replaced by a man who'd learned the difference between being successful and being worthy. "David," Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we know we don't deserve to be here." She paused, struggling with words that had clearly been rehearsed but still felt impossible to say. "We lost everything, the stores, the house. But the real loss was throwing away our family. But what struck me most was what happened next. The rain against the windows seemed to punctuate their desperation, each drop carrying the weight of regret they'd been too proud to acknowledge before. I watched David's face carefully, seeing the internal battle between the hurt son-in-law and the man who'd learned that healing sometimes requires extending the same grace you've received. "We're not here for money," Frank said quickly, reading the skepticism in David's eyes. "We know about the foundation, about Helen. We're here to ask if there's any way we can prove that we've learned from our mistakes." Tyler stepped closer to his father, his 12-year-old protective instincts sharp as ever. "Dad," he said quietly, "didn't they say we were burdens? Why do they want us back now?" The brutal honesty of that question hung in the air like a challenge. David looked at me, and I saw decades of wisdom pass between us in a single glance. This was his decision to make, but my presence gave him the confidence to make it from a place of strength rather than desperation. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped aside and gestured them into the warm light of his living room. "You can't just walk back into their lives," David said quietly, nodding toward the children. "Trust isn't a switch you flip. It's a bridge you build board by board. If you're serious about being part of this family again, you'll have to prove it the same way Helen did, through consistent actions over time, not promises you've already broken once." That night, after Frank and Carol left with David's conditional offer to let them earn their way back through work at the foundation, I sat on my back patio, watching the desert stars and thinking about the strange mathematics of family. For years I'd convinced myself that love was about standards and expectations, about maintaining dignity and social position. I'd been so wrong it was almost laughable, if it wasn't so heartbreaking. David found me there around midnight, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of thoughtful expression that meant he'd been wrestling with big questions. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside me. I was thinking about Frank and Carol, I admitted, and about second chances, and about the difference between earning forgiveness and expecting it. I took a sip of coffee and studied my son's profile in the moonlight. I know I don't deserve the grace you've shown me, David. I know that creating the Hope Foundation doesn't erase the years I wasn't there. David was quiet for a moment. Then he surprised me with a small smile. Mom, the difference between you and the Martinezes isn't that you made different mistakes. It's that you're trying to fix yours, without expecting anything in return. Frank and Carol want forgiveness because they need something from us. You asked for forgiveness, and then spent 3 months proving you meant it by putting our needs first. So what do we do about them? I asked. They are the children's grandparents, and despite everything, they did take you in when you needed shelter. We do what you taught me, David said. We offer them the same chance you've given yourself, the opportunity to earn their way back into our lives through actions, not words. If they want to be part of this family, they can start by working at the Hope Foundation, minimum wage like any other applicant. If they're serious about family being more important than pride, they can prove it. 2 years have passed since that conversation under the desert stars. Frank and Carol Martinez work in our foundation's warehouse now, processing donations and helping with community outreach. They see Tyler, Sophie, and Jake every weekend, but they earn that time by showing up consistently and putting the children's needs first. It's not the reunion they expected, but it's the one they needed. The children, with their infinite capacity for healing, have taught us all that love isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. As for me, I've learned that wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in bedtime stories read, school plays attended, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that were too quiet for too long. I've learned that the greatest inheritance I can leave isn't money, but the knowledge that love, real love, always finds a way back home. The Hope Foundation has housed over 200 veteran families now, and David has become the face of veteran advocacy in Arizona. Marcus Thompson, the young veteran we helped in that McDonald's parking lot, now runs our job training program. Tyler wants to be a civil engineer so he can build better houses for people who need them. Sophie draws pictures of complete families now, with everyone smiling and arms stretched wide enough to hold whoever needs holding. And Jake calls me Grandma Helen, and saves his best jokes for our Sunday morning pancake breakfasts. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give isn't our wealth or our wisdom, but simply the courage to admit we were wrong, and the dedication to spend whatever time we have left making it right. Money can buy many things, but it can't buy back lost time. What it can do, if you're lucky enough to get a second chance, is help you build something better with the time you have remaining. Life teaches patience, how to bloom when the conditions are right, how to conserve what matters during the difficult seasons, how to send roots deep enough to weather any storm. At 72, I'm finally learning what my grandmother's garden taught me decades ago, that the most beautiful growth often comes after the harshest winters, and that love, like life itself, finds a way to flourish even in the most impossible circumstances. If this story touched your heart the way it's touched mine, please leave me a comment below. Have you ever had to swallow your pride to save a relationship that mattered? Have you found your way back to family after losing your way? I'd love to hear your story. And I know others watching would find hope in knowing they're not alone in their struggles. Please like this video if it spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about the complicated, beautiful journey of being human. Thank you for listening to an old woman share her heart. It means more than you'll ever know.